while we miss attending these events in person and in our shuls, we're grateful we can still participate through the digital world. Along those lines, one, if you have an interest in doing so, please pin the sign language into.
Yeah, now I hear us here talking. Now I see them and hear.
Second.
I just muted everyone. Nissy, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, second, except for designated speakers, all others will be muted. And third, if you have any questions, please direct them to Ken Jacobson directly and not to everyone else. He will present them to Mrs. Kalib at the end of her presentation. Now, the term Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, refers to the state-organized anti-Jewish riots in Germany and in Austria of November 9th and 10th, 1938. The riots marked a major transition in Nazi policy. They were a harbinger of the final solution. In 2 days and nights, more than 1,000 shuls were burnt or otherwise damaged. Rioters ransacked and looted 7,500 Jewish businesses, killed at least 91 Jews, vandalized Jewish hospitals, homes, schools, and cemeteries. Some 30,000 Jewish males aged 16 to 30 were arrested. To accommodate so many new prisoners, the concentration camps of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. The stage was set for the final solution, the organized, bureaucratically efficient genocide of 6 million children, women, and men. In retrospect, Kristallnacht was more than a shattering of windows and illusions. It portended the physical destruction of European Jewry. As such, the commemoration must be memorial and as a warning. Tonight, my Maridasra, David Rosenbaum, will speak to us. Mrs. Golda Kalib will then speak to us about her experiences and miraculous survival.
Okay, good.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to thank the committee for all of their hard work. The people who have been working on this, I know Ken and Nissy and Debbie, and I'm sure so many others have been working for a very long time on this project. Of course, I want to thank Mrs. Kalib for giving us the time to share her experiences. And it's always an honor for our shul to jointly work on this program with KMS. And I want to thank Rabbi Weinberg for being with us as well. In this past week's Torah portion, there's a very strange section of verses. The Torah talks about Yitzchak, the patriarch Isaac, digging wells. There had been tensions between Abraham and some of the neighbors regarding wells. And the Torah goes into great detail that Yitzchak himself dug wells. And it tells us that he dug 3 wells. And the first well, he had many difficulties with his neighbors. They haggled with him, grappled with him over all types of things. And he called that well Asek, which is a language referring to arguments, tension. And he moved on to do a second well. And after he dug the second well, the neighbors, the other shepherds in the area, caused him problems yet again. And he called that well Sitna, hatred. And then he moved on to a third well, and he didn't have any problems. And he called that well Rechovos, because Rechovos meaning a broad expanse, that God had created great opportunity for Yitzchak and that he would flourish in the land. What a strange set of verses. The commentaries say different things about this section, but the Ramban says a striking thing. He says that the 3 wells which Isaac dug are an allusion to the 3 temples. We know that the Jewish people had 2 temples in Jerusalem, and each one tragically was destroyed by our enemies. And we know that the third one, which we're still hoping and praying for, will ultimately be built, and with that will come the ultimate redemption of the Jewish people. The Ramban says that what the Torah is teaching us is the core behind the destruction of each of the first 2 temples was hatred. Hatred from our neighbors. And it's such a striking thing to think about. And by the way, when the Torah talks about the experiences of Abraham, Isaac's father, it talks about the terrible jealousy that the neighbors had towards Abraham and then subsequently his son Isaac. And it's upsetting, but striking to think about how this is so much the Jewish story. We, of course, think correctly so that the reason why the temples were destroyed was because we didn't merit to have the temples further, and that's true. But the Ramban says that the Torah is also teaching us that these great structures of Jewish faith and religion and gathering were destroyed because of the hatred of our neighbors. There's a classic idea that a Jewish home is considered to be a temple in the miniature. How many Jewish temples, mini temples, were destroyed through the generations thanks to the hatred of our neighbors, a spirit of jealousy. And this is a very sad thing to think of, a very tragic thing to think of, but I think there's something inspiring in it as well, that back to the days of Abraham and Isaac, there was always this struggle. And the only Jewish response is to do what Isaac did. Keep on digging, keep on trying, realize that there are people around us who are always looking to pull us down, but don't allow that to be cause for giving up. Isaac kept on digging, and ultimately God blessed his efforts. As we gather for Kristallnacht, which is such an important thing for us to gather and think about and remember, we have the distressing reminder of how there have always been people who hate us. But thanks to our wonderful guest and so many others who we look to as tremendous role models, we also have the reminder that for all the hatred, the Jewish people have continued to strive and continue to dig. And we pray that just as Isaac had the experience, the day will come where God brings us our ultimate salvation and we no longer have to worry about such terrible hatred. With God's help, it should be speedily for us in our days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. So now we come to the main speaker. I'm Ken Jacobson, and it's my pleasure to present to you Golda Szachter Kalib. So Goldie, please, it's all yours.
Okay. I was born in Poland in a small town called Bodzentyn. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and that turned out to be the beginning of World War II. I was 7 years old at the time. As the German armies advanced through Poland, virtually unopposed, panic erupted in Bodzentyn in anticipation of imminent bombings and German entry into the city. And people began fleeing. Some ran eastward, others ran south or north, with no one knowing why they were going in any particular direction. My father also arranged for 2 horse-led wagons to transport our immediate family, and we too were on our way. Where to? At first uncertain. We went to 2 cities southeast of Bodzentyn, where my father had friends, business associates, where we spent a few days until my father's plan of action crystallized in his mind. If at all possible, he would reach and cross the border into what was then Soviet Russia. As evening descended on the first day of our journey, we began hearing the blast and seeing the fire of exploding bombs across the sky in the distance. Within moments, soldiers of a retreating Polish army unit began seizing horses from fleeing civilians on the road. After successfully fighting off one such attempt and the horse pulling the wagon father was driving, he immediately changed directions and got off the road. It was now obvious we could no longer get to Russia, and we headed back toward Bodzentyn. We did, in fact, go back to Bodzentyn, but father decided to go to a one-time summer vacation site 3 kilometers from Bodzentyn. The roads leading to that remote village were narrow and bumpy, and father correctly reasoned that advancing armies would probably avoid it. After a few days there, it was announced over the radio that hostilities had ended in Poland, and the new administration was requesting all citizens to return to their homes and resume the routines of daily life, assuring there was nothing to fear by law-abiding citizens. We did return to our home, where we lived for 3 years till October 1942 under Nazi occupation. There was a small semblance of normality being home. However, curfew, periodic appearance of the German gendarmerie in town, and ever increasing edicts against the Jewish population, to say nothing of the periodic savage atrocities, terrorized young and old. Just a few examples. In school, it was announced that Jewish children would no longer be allowed to attend.
Let's try the phone. Okay, go ahead, speak on the phone. I think we can hear you on the phone.
The Nazis were madmen, cut their beards and sideburns.
Can you mute your computer?
I
Shalom?
muted their computer and
Oh,
the
okay.
phone is working. We are able to hear you when you talk on the phone.
The Nazis were madmen, cut their beards.
It's fine.
We're
It's
able to
good.
hear you with that very well. So if you hold the phone just like you held it a minute ago, we're able to hear you very well.
Please continue.
The Nazis were madmen, cut their beards and sideburns, pull at their beards, jeer, and often torture. But I will skip to the events which led my father to the decision to abandon our lifelong home. By 1942, it was known that liquidations were taking place in city after city throughout Poland. A liquidation meant the Germans rounded up Jews in every little village, town, and city, herded them into trains, and shipped them off to death camps to be gassed. My father,
Hello?
Continue. It's working well. Continue.
Yes, keep going. It's fine.
My father desperately tried to avoid that fate for our family. He knew of a munitions factory in a city called Starachowice, located about 18 kilometers from our town. The work being done there was very important to the German war effort. He thought if he could only get the family into the factory as laborers, then perhaps our lives could be saved, at least temporarily. He had a boyhood friend in Starachowice, Shlomo Einesman, who worked as a bootmaker for the top German officials in the factory. My father contacted him and explained the situation. My friend informed him. My father contacted him and explained the situation. His friend informed him.
Excuse me, we still need Mrs. Kalib to speak into the telephone.
My father contacted him and explained the situation. His friend informed him that our family would first have to come to Starachowice, and then perhaps he could get ID cards for us as laborers in the factory. My father agreed to the plan, and Einesman bribed a top German official in the factory who came in a covered truck to Bodzentyn and transported our entire family to Starachowice. Einesman was able to procure ID cards for each member of our family except me. I was simply too young at age 10 to pass as a worker. Now that posed quite a problem for my family as to what to do with me. I remember many hush-hush discussions and a lot of worry. Finally, an uncle of mine suggested that my father contact a Mrs. Sorowiecka, who had been a customer of his, and he knew her to be a fine Christian humanitarian lady. Perhaps she would be willing to shelter me. My father was in touch with her, and Mrs. Sorowiecka asked for a few days to think the matter over and also discuss it with her nephew, who was in the Polish underground fighting against the Nazis. Mrs. Sorowiecka did agree to shelter me for an indefinite period of time. When my father informed me that I would have to leave to be with a Polish Christian family, I gradually became very apprehensive. But I knew that if I refused to leave, my entire family might have to go to their deaths with me, or I might have to go to my death alone. I did not want to be responsible for the deaths of my entire family, and I was more afraid to go alone than I was afraid of dying. I had no choice. After a few days, Ben Kazimierz, Mrs. Sorowiecka's nephew came to pick me up. We walked a long way till we reached his horse and buggy, which was parked in the outskirts of the city because Jews were not allowed to travel. On the way, I saw an older cousin of mine. He approached me, kissed my forehead, and left without saying a word. We both knew that he understood what was happening. We never saw each other again. He did not survive the war.
Shalom, can you try to mute your speakers, your loudspeakers? Turn them down, please, if you can do that.
It
The
was,
volume on your speakers.
it was unmuted, and now I just turned off. It's not.
Okay.
muted.
So we'll only use the phone. Okay, Goldie, please continue.
As we rode to Świętomarz, night had descended. For the first time in my life, at age 10, I was separated from my family, going with a strange man to live with a Christian family whom I had never even met. Like possible. My thoughts rushing through my mind plunged my heart to the lowest depths of pain. I fought with all my strength to be brave. When we arrived in Świętomarz, I remember Ben opening a creaking gate, and I heard the loud bark of a dog I couldn't see. Ben showed me to my room and a small bed covered with a reddish knitted bedspread. In the morning, Mrs. Sorowiecka introduced herself to me. She wasted no time and began teaching me the rituals of the church. She lengthened my dresses and straightened my hair so that I would look more like a Polish peasant girl. She told me, from here on, you are Halinka Bertusovna, my niece from Krakow. She told her husband, who was quite a bit older than herself, the same tale, adding that my parents were communists. Therefore, it was unsafe for me to be at home. She did indeed have such a niece in Krakow, whom her husband had never met. Mr. Sorowiecki took me to church every day. One time during services, I inadvertently crossed myself with my left hand. Mr. Sorowiecki immediately knew that I was not Halinka Bertusovna, but that his wife was sheltering a Jewish child. He told me that he knew who I was and informed me that had his wife asked him beforehand whether to shelter me, he would not have agreed, but added, since you are here, I will treat you just the same as before. It was around this time that word spread in the village that the Sorowiecki's were sheltering a Jewish child. One time, Mr. Zvada, a shoemaker from Bodzentyn, came in to do some work for the Sorowiecki's and recognized me. When Mrs. Sorowiecka tried to deny my identity, he said, even the shoes she is wearing, I made. Another time, a beggar woman recognized me. And again, when Mrs. Sorowiecka tried to deny who I was, she said, "Don't worry, I will not inform on her." Her mother was always very nice to me. When out in the street, I would occasionally now hear the word Żydowica, a derogatory word for Jew. One night, Germans came into the village, and Mrs. Sorowiecka woke me and explained that I would have to be hidden out in the garden in an empty beehive. It was a nice, balmy night, but my teeth kept chattering and my body shivered as if from cold. Mrs. Sorowiecka came out every 15 minutes to inquire, "Halinka, Halinka, how are you?" She brought out a blanket and some medicine to try to calm me down. She told me that eventually I had fallen asleep. In the morning, Mrs. Sorowiecka came out to the garden to let me know that the Germans had left the village and I could come out of the beehive. Oh, it was such a relief to be able to straighten my body and to know that the Germans had left. But the Sorowiecki's feared for my life and their own. It was therefore decided that Mr. Sorowiecki would take me to a nearby village where they owned some farmland and a barn. They also had a friend there, Mrs. Maria Sawiczka. They wanted Mrs. Sawiczka to shelter me in her house for several weeks, but she refused because sheltering a Jew was punishable by death. But she did agree that if I stayed in the Sorowiecki barn, she would bring food to me 3 times a day. She not only brought me food, she also brought me some children's books to read. Nights were very scary in the barn because I could often hear some birds that would fly in, other times a stray cat. During the day, most of the time, I sat on a straw sack and read my books. Often I would look out through the cracks of the barn and see the lush, spacious green fields and smell the fresh farm air. It was then that I hoped and prayed that one day I would be able to run and play in the fields the way I did before the war in Bodzentyn. After 2 weeks, Mr. Sorowiecki picked me up to bring me back to their household. They were hoping that perhaps some of the gossip would have died down, but the situation was just as dangerous as before I had left. So this time the Sorowiecki's decided to take me yet to another village called Swishlina, where they had some friends. They requested that Mr. and Mrs. Galek, their friends, shelter me for 3 months. However, they told the Galeks that I am Halinka Bertusovna, the same tale Mrs. Sorowiecka had originally told her husband. They couldn't tell the Galeks the truth because they knew that their friends were intensely anti-Semitic. Now, since at all times I had to pretend while at the Galax to be Halinka Bertusovna, one thought kept plaguing me. What if at night I dreamed and spoke some words out loud in Jewish? Fortunately, that never happened. I often heard the Galax and their friends talk about Jews in derogatory terms. They often even sang little rhyming ditties with very anti-Semitic overtones, while never realizing that there was a Jewish child right in their midst. One time, an incident happened there which proved to be very traumatic. Germans came into the village, and Mrs. Galek handed me a slab of meat they had received from the Sorowiecki's as a gift for keeping me. And she asked me to walk through the meadow, down the valley, where there were some bushes, and hide. She was afraid that the Germans would confiscate the meat. I realized while I was hiding that if I were to be caught and questioned, the Germans would find out that I was Jewish. I therefore hid the meat under a bush, and I walked away some distance so as not to be caught with the meat. After about half an hour, Mrs. Galek called, "Halinka, Halinka, you can come back now. The Germans have left." I ran for the meat and couldn't find it. I panicked. What will I tell Mrs. Galek? Obviously, I couldn't tell her the truth. I ran back and forth 3 or 4 times and fortunately found the meat. The whole incident was brief and did not arouse Mrs. Galek's suspicion. She now asked me to peel some potatoes for supper. I was sitting down and peeling, and suddenly a loud banging was heard. Mrs. Galek opened the door, and 2 Germans arrogantly walked in. Obviously, they had not left the village. I was literally paralyzed with fear. I kept my head down low and kept peeling and peeling those potatoes. Fortunately, after looking around in the house, they left without incident. I breathed a sigh of relief. After 3 months, I returned to the Sorowiecki's. But the situation was just as grave as before I had left. This time, Mrs. Sorowiecka, having no choice, notified my father how dangerous the situation had become. Now, fortunately, my parents were still in the Starachowice slave labor camp rather than in a concentration camp. Through some very ingenious and bold planning, my father was able to bribe some officials and get their cooperation, which made it possible to have me smuggled in to the Starachowice slave labor camp. It would be a vast understatement to say that the Sorowiecki's had been extremely generous to have me sheltered for about a year. Nevertheless, I was thrilled beyond words to be be reunited with my family. That initial euphoria, however, was short-lived. After almost 10 months in the labor camp, the German High Command decided to close down the camp, and we were sent to the Auschwitz concentration camp, where we were interned for 5.5 months. As is very well known, Auschwitz was one of the most, if not the most, infamous of all concentration camps. It is estimated that at least 1 million Jews were exterminated there. It had 4 crematoria, which operated at full speed with billowing flames. From burning flesh raging upward from their chimneys day and night, letting off a continuous, unbearable stench. Whereas most inmates were marched off to work daily, my mother and I were considered unqualified and remained in our barracks. Selections were made irregularly at Auschwitz for the purpose of eliminating the sick and the old. Those who were selected were placed in gas chambers, asphyxiated, and cremated. Once people were selected and hauled away, they were never seen again alive. One day, in late November 1944, when my sisters and my cousins were at work, our barracks officers ordered all in the barracks to line up. Several hundred women were gathered from several barracks to some place unknown to us for a selection. There, the infamous doctor, Joseph Mengele, appeared and made his selection of some 100 women to be gassed and cremated. And my mother and I were among them. We were herded into buses and driven to a gas chamber structure and led into its antechamber, where we were locked in, waiting to be gassed to death. Suddenly, strangely, nothing happened for hours on end. From time to time, Nazis came in for short periods for seemingly no particular purpose other than perhaps to arouse our suspicion and intensify our intents. This went on throughout the day and following night. In the morning, a group of Nazis came into the chamber and herded the entire group into a truck. Everyone assumed we were being taken directly to the ovens. Instead, we were driven to a convalescent barracks within the camp. This had never happened before. In fact, ours was the very last selection at Auschwitz. Simply by this time, the Russian army was quickly approaching Auschwitz, and the Nazis had already apparently begun. Yes. Just give me a moment. By this time, the Russian army was quickly approaching Auschwitz, and the Nazis had apparently began to dismantle the camp and decided or ordered by the superiors not to consummate our extermination. It is this miraculous event which I chose for the title of my memoir, published in 1990 by the University of Massachusetts Press, namely The Last Selection. After Auschwitz, we were sent on the infamous death camp to Bergen Belsen, a concentration camp in West Germany. These two episodes of Auschwitz and Bergen Belsen in themselves constitute a large part of my Holocaust experience. In April 1945, I was liberated in Bergen Belsen with my mother and two sisters. My mother, however, by that time was so sick and emaciated, she died 4 weeks later. My father and two brothers did not survive. My story has been written up and is mentioned, published by the University Massachusetts Press in 1990. This is part of my story.
Thank you.
And I hope that you could hear me and understand me.
Thank you very much, Goldie. And on behalf of our entire community, we all thank you for this very vivid and heart-wrenching story of your survival. And I strongly recommend your book, which is quite well written. So thank you again. So now we have time for a few questions, but do not speak the questions. Please stay muted, but type the questions into the chat to me specifically, and I will read them to Goldie.
Okay.
So anyone in the audience who has questions is now invited to write those questions into the chat. So, yes, we have a few comments. Rochelle Slamovich says, my mother, Miriam Glatt, and her sisters, Honka and Sally, were in the labor camp with you. I'm excited to see you. And she's ordered the book.
She is.
Rochelle Slamovich, her mother is Miriam Glatt. Okay. Many people said thank you for this touching presentation. One question is, how old were you when you were liberated?
About 13. About 13 years old.
Okay. Was the family that you stayed with recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous Gentiles?
Yes, they were.
Great. Goldie, how did you meet Shalom?
Why don't I let Shalom tell you how he met me?
Okay.
After the war,
At the Bergen Belsen concentration camp,
it became
a displaced persons camp, and they had a makeshift school in it. And one of the teachers, his name was Mayor Markovitz, Olav Shalom. It was about 1953. Mayor Markovitz was in touch with Goldie's sister, Rochelle Eisenberg, Alaha Shalom, and they knew each other from Bergen Belsen. And from word to word, Rochelle let Mayor Markowitz know that she had a younger sister that Mayor remembered from Bergen Belsen, but was not married. And Mayor Markowitz told her he knew of a young cantor in his shul where he was educational director, and the two of them thought they would try to put us together. They arranged for us to meet, and that was in November 1953, and we married in June, the next year.
Thank you. Now back to Goldie. Were there other children with you in Auschwitz?
I don't remember any other children in our barracks or in Auschwitz.
Another question. How did your father die?
Oh, well, that's a good question. You know, men were separated from women.
Just a minute. I better see what Goldie is relating to you is what occurred on the train ride from Starachowice to Auschwitz. Now let her continue.
And in the same car where my father and brothers were, there were some people there from a camp, not from Starachowice. They had come to Starachowice from another camp, and supposedly they were very, how should I call them, very jealous of other people, that we were doing well in Starachowice and they were not. And they started a fight. And it seems that they attacked my father, and my younger brother tried to defend him. And they killed both of them, my father and my younger brother.
Thank you. Another question. How did you spend your time with your family in the labor camp? How often did you get to see your family, and what did you do during the day? What kind of work did you do?
Well, in the labor camp, I was with my family, and it was a lot more lenient, a lot more than a concentration camp. And my mother had a job there to work in the laundry, and I used to go with her every day to help out do the laundry. So that's basically how I spent my day.
Thank you. Another question. Many people who survived the Holocaust are afraid to share their story, but you are brave to share yours. What makes you brave enough to share the story?
Well, actually, I didn't want Shalom to write the story, and I didn't want to tell it. But he convinced me that he is going to write it, and that's what he really thought, just for the children and grandchildren. But somehow, once the story was written and published, it came out, and they started to call me without an end to go and talk. And so I talked very often.
And we are so happy you did. So I would like to conclude with a few comments in praise of your talk. Thank you for sharing your story. You are an inspiration. And another comment, what a brilliant, courageous woman you are. You expressed yourself so articulately. And I think everyone is pleased to hear your story. And we empathize with you, although it's beyond our imagination, the horrors that you suffered. But thank you once again for sharing this with us tonight. And I wish everyone, I'd like to thank, first of all, the people on the committee who worked on this program, and Miriam Kramer, who did the interpreting, Joyce Dworsky, and others who were involved in the planning, Rabbi Rosenbaum, Debbie Katz, Menashe Katz, and Nissi Moskowitz. And finally, I thank all of you, and I wish you a good night.
I want to tell you, it was really my pleasure to talk to you. It was under difficult conditions, but it was still my pleasure, and I'm very happy that I talked.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Kalib. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Kalib. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
It was great. It was great.
Thank you very much.